Welcome to a Sun News special, Mid-East Media Bias Exposed, and a look at how news groups shape the message about the war between Israel and Hamas. It's been going on for close to a month now, and there's no sign in the end of the fighting, either the shooting war or the media war. And make no mistake, the war between Israel and Hamas right now is just as much about the media as it is about the bullets and the rockets. Hamas knows they cannot defeat Israel militarily, but they can weaken their mortal enemy by turning world opinion against them, by isolating Israel. Much of the world's media is not on Israel's side, so much for the old lie about Jews controlling all the media. Most outlets don't give Israel a fair shake. Hamas started this battle, and the battle continues because Hamas continues to rain rockets down on civilian targets in Israel. But take a look at this stunning statistic from the Israeli Defense Force. Since the fighting began, more than 2,800 rockets have been fired on Israel. Hamas is also hitting its own people with their own rocket fire, again from the IDF. 50 rockets fired from Gaza landed in Gaza in the last 24 hours. Despite this, despite the humanitarian windows, the ceasefires, the supplies offered by Israel to the people of Gaza, the rocket attacks continue, and so does the media bombardment. Prime Minister Stephen Harper was asked about the ongoing fighting in light of Israel hitting a United Nations school that was being used to shelter refugees fleeing the fighting. The media outrage, I think, is pretty much summed up in this headline from the Canadian Press story on CBC's website. It reads, Stephen Harper maintains Hamas is to blame after shelling of UN school in Gaza. Here's what Harper said. Obviously, no one likes to see the suffering and loss of life that has occurred. He told reporters this in Arange, Saskatchewan. That said, we hold the terrorist organization Hamas responsible for this. They have initiated and continued this conflict and continue to seek the destruction of the state of Israel. That's not opinion, people. That's fact. And so is it fact that Hamas has been firing from locations like the school that was hit, and at least 3 times Hamas weapons have been found in United Nations schools in Gaza, and the UN has handed those weapons back to Hamas. None of this, by the way, was included in the story that was outraged at Stephen Harper. They just wanted to point out how unbelievable it was that Stephen Harper blames Hamas instead of Israel. But most of the media gives Hamas a pass, really, while holding Israel to a higher standard. Look at how Haroon Siddiqui, a prominent columnist in the Toronto Star, the biggest circulation newspaper in Canada, look at how he describes the fighting. Has Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other Gaza militants rained down mostly primitive and mostly ineffective rockets on Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu unleashes some of the most modern and lethal arsenal on Gaza homes, hospitals, health clinics, nursing and rehab centers, mosques, and office buildings. So more than 2,800 rockets are simply dismissed as primitive. They can kill, but that doesn't matter to Siddiqui. Israel weapons, well, they're more high-tech. That makes them the bad guy. Maybe the people of Gaza would be better protected if Hamas didn't spend all their money on rockets and building tunnels that they use to try and kill Jews in Israel. But then again, that is their stated purpose, something most of the media never look at. There may be calls for peace and negotiations, but the fact is Hamas isn't interested. The Hamas Charter clearly states the following. Initiatives in so-called peaceful solutions and international conferences are in contradiction to the principles of the Islamic resistance movement. The Hamas Charter is really a fascinating read. It's easily found online. It's easy to get through if you can stomach all the Jew hatred, which there's plenty of. But most of the world's media, they're not going to read it. And if they do, they're not going to mention it in their coverage as they ponder why the fighting won't stop. Well, it's really easy. Read the Hamas Charter, which also states Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it. That's a quote from Hassan al-Banna. He's the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, which Hamas claims to be a part of, in addition to the Islamic resistance movement. Time and again, Hamas is given a pass, and whether it's people like Marc Garneau and Justin Trudeau in the Liberal Party or Paul Dewar in the NDP, Barack Obama in the United States, they'll just say they want the Israelis to sit down. They just want them to sit down and talk about peace with Israel. They want to be rid of the Jews. That's Hamas's opening position. But you won't hear that. Here's what the Hamas Charter states again. Israel, Judaism, and Jews challenge Islam and the Muslim people. May the cowards never sleep. Does that sound like someone you want to sit down and negotiate with? Because I'd call that a threat. The Hamas Charter also talks about what it refers to as Allah's promise in the fight against the Jews. It says the day of judgment will not come until Muslims fight the Jews, killing the Jews. When the Jew will hide behind stones and trees, the stones and trees will say, "O Muslims, O Abdullah, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him." Only the Garkad tree, evidently a kind of tree, would not do that because it is one of the trees of the Jews. Really? People ask why I support Israel. Look at the two sides. One is a liberal democracy that actively seeks peace. The other, a terrorist group that oppresses its own people and seeks to eliminate its neighbors. With choices like that, there can be no moral equivalence between the two sides. There's no other rational option than supporting Israel. Coming up next, a closer look at what has brought us to this point, how the media is covering the war abroad and the war that's at home. That's next. Welcome back. Nearly 10,000 kilometers away, a westernized democracy is locked in a battle with a designated terrorist group. And how we interpret this war depends on the bias of the media reporting it. Which brings us to our first guest, Sun News contributor Paige McPherson. Paige, coverage of the Israeli-Gaza conflict, it's at a fever pitch. It's not always balanced, is it?
No, and I think this is really about an omission of key details to the conflict that so much of the Western media just seems to be leaving out and unwillingly taking part in. Now, there are examples from across the Western world, Brian, really, I mean, some big bad ones from the New York Times showing a disparity in photos. Every photo of Gaza is of bloodied civilians and, bombed hospitals, whereas every photo of Israel seems to be military tanks and military helicopters.
As opposed to civilians being attacked.
Which is, of course,
bombed out homes.
Exactly,
like
happening in Israel, too. Those are photos that are simply being omitted from their coverage. Then you can look at, the Daily Telegraph in the UK, and you can see that one of their bloggers, one of their reporters on the ground there said, called it a genocide in Gaza, just casually used the term a genocide, and that's a reporter doing live blogging of what's happening there. So there are those examples from across the Western world that are concerning, but there are egregious examples here at home as well. And one of those examples that really stood out to me was a CBC National report that aired. That report was called "How the Ongoing Gaza Conflict Has Changed." So I have an excerpt of that to show you.
Israel's current campaign, dubbed Operation Protective Edge, is the third major confrontation between Israel and Hamas, the Islamic resistance movement, over the past 6 years. There are constants. Both sides accuse the other of starting the fight. Both sides claim self-defense, and inevitably, it is the Palestinian people who bear the brunt of the suffering. Critics accusing Israel of using disproportionate force. Another constant, UN buildings hit, like the one sheltering hundreds of displaced people today, and the Israeli response that Hamas hides its rockets in schools and hospitals.
So there are a few issues with that. There's details that are omitted, and then there are just details that are not well explained. Calling Hamas an Islamic resistance movement.
That is how they describe themselves.
That's how they describe themselves.
But they also describe themselves as wanting to obliterate the state of Israel.
That's right.
That's not included.
And here in Canada, where the CBC is our national broadcaster, they are a terrorist group. They are a listed terrorist organization, Hamas, in Canada. So that detail, not omitted. It also talked about how both sides say the other one started it. Well, clearly in this conflict, we know how the current conflict started. It started with the kidnapping and eventual murder of 3 Israeli teenagers. So you can say that both sides are claiming that the other started it. That's fine. But why not then include the detail? But really, we know how this started.
Include when you say that Israel claims Hamas hides rockets in UN schools and hospitals. Point out that they have 3 times been caught doing that, and that the UN has handed those rockets and those weapons back.
Exactly. Not calling it an Israeli claim, rather calling it simply a fact that the UN has pointed out themselves.
This is a war that's far away, but the protests happen here as well. And then the media coverage of that is lopsided.
Absolutely. There's one very good example from the Al-Quds Day coverage that happened here in Toronto. Sun News was there. Other media networks were there as well, and here, just take a look at some of their coverage to see how they decided to cover this event.
People from each side of the conflict gathered opposite one another, separated by barricades and by police. The protest was heated at times.
And I just want peace, and that's my message today.
A message of peace, perhaps one thing these two sides can agree on.
Among the thousands here in the crowd were also members of the Jewish Defense League, an extreme right-wing organization that has come under criticism for its views, even by the city's Jewish community. No matter what side these protesters are on, in the end, everyone here is hoping for the same outcome.
So the reporting there across the board pretty much summed up that everybody's looking for peace and that everybody there is looking for the same outcome.
It's Al-Quds Day. It's a day started by Ayatollah Khomeini to denounce, to start the founding of Israel.
Again,
that calls for Israel to be destroyed.
Exactly, but a small insignificant detail that I suppose the media didn't feel that they needed to point out.
Did they even talk to anybody there?
Well, we did, and I can tell you that that led me to believe, watching that footage, that I don't know if both sides really wanted the same thing here. So here's some of what we saw at the Al-Quds Day rally.
Israel does not believe on humanity. They want to make money with the blood of the human being.
Israel and Zionism are destined to the dustbin of history in our lifetime, inshallah. And with that, mark my words.
Israel destined for the dustbin of history. That's said from the microphone
Exactly.
page. That was not some random guy wandering around that they would have to look for. This is from the official speakers list. How can they miss that?
Exactly, that's right. You know, we go into the rallies, we'll ask people exactly what you're thinking. I've done this at anti-Israel rallies, pro-Palestinian rallies. I've done this at pro-Israel rallies. Both times I want to get the opinion of what people are saying in the crowd. But yeah, when you have one of the actual speakers there standing on a tailgate with his microphone and you can't put that detail into your reporting that he's calling for the end of Israel, well, I don't think that's exactly what both sides were wanting at Al-Quds Day. I didn't see that from the pro-Israel side. So it is really just this omission of detail that we're seeing here at home.
All right. Shameless reporting. They should be hanging their heads. Well, up next, we delve deeper into Canada's media bias run wild, how your taxpayer dollars are funding only one side of the story. Welcome back. Gaza's democratically elected government, Hamas, is a recognized terrorist group, designated so by the United States, the EU, Egypt, Jordan, and yes, even Canada. But as we saw in the last segment, Canada's national broadcaster won't call them terrorists, opting instead to use words like militants or calling them the PC Islamic Resistance Movement. That's how they'll describe Hamas. This isn't an opinion. It's codified in the CBC handbook, which reads, "It is a long-standing practice to use the words terrorist or terrorism when they are attributed by others." She explained that the practice is to describe the act or individual as a bomber, militant, extremist, or gunman, for instance, and let the viewer, reader, or listener make his own judgment about the nature of the event. The purpose of journalism is to reflect reality, to inform, and give viewers and listeners enough information so they can reach their own conclusions. The CBC's one-sided stance on Israel-Gaza goes beyond semantics. Joining me now to discuss this, Sun News contributor Ray Hurd. Ray, I mean, you've been in journalism longer than most of them at CBC have been working. Let me ask you, is refusing to call a terrorist group whose objective is to rid the world of Israel, is that reflecting reality, or is that making a judgment call they shouldn't be making?
It is a reality because the definition of a terrorist is simple. It's someone who deliberately kills civilians, and that's what Hamas is all about. But the CBC obviously has never read the works of George Orwell, who invented a term, newspeak. Newspeak is another way of describing things. It's propaganda, and it applies to the state broadcaster. And you and I, Brian, as owners of the CBC, have every right to be outraged but not surprised when the CBC calls terrorists militants. They are not militants, they are terrorists, period.
All right, I want to play a montage of clips from CBC and just give people a sense of what we're talking about here. This isn't just Ray and Brian being upset at one example.
Paul Hunter has our story from Gaza. In a sense, life returned to the Gaza Strip today after days of Israeli bombardment of Gaza and of Hamas rockets targeting Israel. A truce. Only when the Israelis give in to the demands of Hamas, this man told us, the Palestinians agree to a full ceasefire. In the south, they were digging bodies from the bombed rubble today, including, yes, children. In the north, misery. I mean, it's incredible. I don't know what words to use. The Israelis say their assaults target only Hamas and that they warned this area would be hit hard. Indeed, it's why most here fled before it was flattened.
Unreal. So that's Paul Hunter of CBC. Yeah. Israel is warning people to leave ahead of time. Does Hamas do that?
No. Hamas builds shelters for Hamas terrorist leaders. Israel builds shelters for civilians. But everyone's missing the context here. The fact is this, Brian, were it not for the Iron Shield Israeli anti-missile system, thousands of Israelis would be dead today compared with hundreds of Palestinians. So the reason that this is a body count contest like the Vietnam War, which I covered, everyone's talking about the body count. But I look at what the body count would be if Israel did not have superior brains and technology to have an anti-missile shield to protect civilians.
And they decided after the last time that Hamas wanted to pour rockets down on Israel, we can't have this. They developed it. The technology is only a few years old, but it's working because, as you point out, the body count on the Israeli side much lower.
Sure. And you've mentioned the CBC, which is one of the main culprits here. Do you know what's sad about this? Guess who teaches journalism at most Canadian journalism schools? Failed neo-Marxist CBC reporters, including a guy called Tony Berman, who, having wrecked CBC News, started Al Jazeera English, which is a propaganda agency for the Muslim Brotherhood.
Well, yeah, and so it's not surprising to see what comes out of the journalism schools. I used to deal with interns and students, and it's hard to undo some of the propaganda and brainwashing
when I ran Global, I would not hire from one of the journalism schools because I knew that the professors were propagandizing them in neo-Marxist attitudes.
You brought another example you wanted to read off to me, a headline. This is Huffington Post, and this is shocking. Post,
this is the associate editor, whose name is Mohammed Omar. He's a Palestinian, and he's also involved with Ryerson Journalism School. And his headline is, "Why aren't Harper and Baird angry about dead babies in Gaza?" Now, the facts are these. Harper and Baird have both expressed regret over the death of civilians in this conflict. So that is not telling the truth. And I pity any students at Ryerson who have to deal with Mr. Mohammed Omar because he shouldn't be teaching or involved in, I'm not sure what his exact title is, but he is part of the problem. And I'm surprised that the Huffington Post would employ someone like this, but it's a free country and readers have a free choice.
Yeah, and as we saw, CBC went after John Baird, claiming, why won't you comment on the civilian casualties? And they did that minutes after he did in his opening statement. So this is an ongoing theme that Stephen Harper and John Baird don't care about that. But let's remind folks, Ray, we'll have to end it on this, is that we keep hearing about the number of deaths in Gaza. They're not all civilians. A good number of them are terrorists.
And by the way, Syria has over 100,000 deaths, and I haven't seen anyone having a nervous breakdown about that at the CBC or in the left.
All right. Very good point. Well, coming up after the break, if you think the Israel-Gaza media bias is limited to Canada, guess again. Welcome back to Sun News' special look at Mideast media coverage exposed. Joining me now to discuss how the Israel-Gaza crisis is being covered in the U.S. and beyond is our own John Robson. John, we've talked about CBC problems in covering this, but it goes around the world. It kind of does put to the lie the idea that Jews control the world media and they're always favorable to Israel, because whether it is CBC or the New York Times or CNN, as we'll show in a minute, Israel doesn't get a break in how it reacts to a never-ending bombardment from Hamas rockets.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. It reminds me of that joke about two Jews in the Russian Empire sitting on a bench, and one of them is reading the Hebrew Herald. He looks over, he realizes his buddy is reading the Pogrom Post. He says, "What are you doing reading that thing? It's full of anti-Semitic lies. Why are you that trash?" And his friend says, "Well, look at the one you're reading. In that one, we're getting beaten up, we're getting raped, we're victims of pogroms. In mine, we control the world." And this notion of the Jews as in charge of everything, but it just goes to show how much anti-Semitism there still is in the world. And the people who seem most alert to racism, and will see racism in any incident that involves two people whose skin is not exactly the same color, are exceptionally blind to the role of anti-Semitism, to the extraordinarily inflammatory rhetoric that one hears about Jews in parts of the world, and the quiet, pervasive hostility toward Israel because it is Jewish in other parts of the world that dominates the discourse again. And the Israelis keep making this point, saying, what would you do? The Israeli ambassador to the U.S. just said, if 200 million Americans were in bomb shelters, what would you be doing? And this is a question that would be a fair question if it were anybody but Israel. And so it makes you scratch your head or pound your fists on the wall in frustration that when it's Israel, it's so hard to get people to recognize it. It's not just the rocket fire, it's also these tunnels that Israel is under threat from people who want to destroy it and kill all its people. They say, oh, but it's the occupation, it's the occupation. Well, Israel didn't occupy these areas before 1967, so why was it happening before 1967? There is a relentless hostility, these cries of Itbach al-Yahud that you hear, slaughter the Jew. That's what they're saying. That's what the Hamas charter says. If anybody else put out the Hamas charter, the left would be up in arms. If that stuff were in the publication by the Reform Party, they would take it very seriously. But when it's Hamas, it's like, oh, no. Was it Nancy Pelosi just said, well, Qatar assures us they're a humanitarian organization.
Yeah, well, yeah, and Hezbollah was as well, because they gave out sweets at the same time as they gave out rockets. I'm not buying it. I do want to play a clip from CNN and point out a couple of things here. One, there's a moral equivalence within this piece. Two, this was a longer piece. We've cut it down a bit, but it took 2 minutes. It's talking about a strike on a school where civilians were killed. It takes more than 2 minutes to get to the point that there are competing claims over who launched the rocket. This could have been one of the many, many rockets fired from Gaza that landed in Gaza. Let's roll tape.
Once again yesterday, an explosion in a residential neighborhood here in Gaza that ended up killing 8 children and 2 adults on the first day of Eid. That's the end of Ramadan celebrations. There were a lot of people in the streets. Death spread all around. Let's take a look at this.
You'll never get to meet little Mohammed. Mohammed was just yards from his front door. Witnesses say he and the other kids were playing toy guns. They call it Dum Dum. The plastic pistol now broken, the children all dead. A bloody hand mark in a doorway, a lucky escape for them, but not for their grandfather. They say he died buying them holiday candy. Witnesses, young and old, say they heard a drone and then the sound of a missile fired onto their street. The warring factions blame each other. We've heard their excuses before.
We've heard their excuses before. My apologies, by the way. That wasn't a report about a rocket landing in a school, but in a residential neighborhood. I think the point still stands. It's look at this, horrible death and destruction. Oh, by the way, this could have been Hamas or the Palestinians firing on themselves. It's just kind of a throwaway line.
Yeah, and there's no skepticism about anything that they're told. Now, mind you, they're filing from Gaza City. If they file skeptical reports, their lives may be in danger. But they don't tell us that when they file these reports. And the kids were playing with guns. I wonder what game they were playing. Kill the Jews, maybe? Because we don't see these images of all these Hamas camps where children go off for some good, clean summer fun, where they put on bandanas and fake suicide belts and chant, one day we will destroy Israel. And there was a story in the Daily Telegraph, which is normally a much better paper. It was about the shelling of that school. And 13 paragraphs of blood streaming and horror and outrage. There's nothing worse than attacking sleeping children, as if Hamas didn't routinely try and do that in Israel. And then finally they get to one paragraph that says, The Israelis said they were returning fire from the vicinity of the school. And then 14 more paragraphs condemning Israel, lurid, absolutely non-skeptical. Finally, then they say, oh, and the United States is resupplying Israel. Boo, hiss down with the United States. This is not real coverage. And I find this extraordinary because once in a while, they're forced to deal with the fact that Hamas has built these tunnels. And I know the Israelis have been trying very hard to get journalists to look at the tunnels. And when they do, you often get these reports going, whoa, look at this thing. This is scary. So you do get some honest reporting of the fact that Hamas is putting expensive, extensive complex engineering projects, in which I gather, by the way, a fair number of children have died digging these tunnels. Hamas cares so much about Palestinian children, it's willing to sacrifice their lives while it hides out in neighboring countries. And once in a while, you do get reports on this kind of thing and on the nature of the threat, but by and large,
it's a one-sided.
They downplay it.
And I want to ask you, we're almost out of time. I want to ask you about this one-sided aspect. You heard in that report, and I saw it in several others, Israel attacks Gaza during Eid. Israel was responding to rocket fire. If this is such a holy time and you can't attack the people in Gaza during Eid, why was Hamas, why were the other Palestinian terrorist organizations launching rockets during their holiday?
Yeah, I mean, why do they call the Yom Kippur War the Ramadan War? And why were they not embarrassed to attack Israel during Yom Kippur? Why did Clinton halt bombing of Iraq during Ramadan, but not of Serbia during Holy Week? But I want one last thing. There's a throwaway line in an Ottawa Citizen story. Polls in Israel show that 95% of Israeli Jews support this operation. Only 4% think excessive force is used. So when the media internationally does this, they're not influencing a debate inside Israel. They're just convincing Israeli Jews that they're surrounded by hostile idiots, which unfortunately, by and large, is true globally. Nobody would put up with what they're asking Israel to put up with, and yet when it's Israel, all they do is say, look, there they go again, those dirty you-know-what that starts with a J.
Well, John, thanks for joining us. One day, perhaps we will get clean coverage coming out of Israel, but I don't see it happening. Yeah, I don't see it happening anytime soon. Coming up next, ISIS is forcing Iraqi Christians to convert while Syria's civil war rages on, while the media is seemingly ignoring the rest of the Middle East. Stay with us. While Israel and the conflict with Hamas in Gaza seems to get an awful lot of media attention, other far more deadly conflicts do not. Fred Litwin is president of the Free Thinking Film Society, a political commentator as well. He joins us now out of Ottawa. And Fred, I wanted to talk to you about this. The world's eyes, all the world's diplomats are talking about we've got to stop this killing in Gaza. Israel has to do this. Israel has to do that. There's far more deadly conflict in Iraq, Syria, throughout the greater Middle East, and it doesn't get the same attention. Why do you think?
You know, it's a crime in the sense that if you're a Palestinian and you get killed in Syria, nobody really cares. If you're a Palestinian and you get killed in Gaza, it's a world tragedy. Now, all deaths are a tragedy, but there's a lot of death going on in Syria. We've had 170,000 people killed in Syria in the last 3 or 4 years. And by the way, we also have a war being waged against Christians in the whole Middle East. Shouldn't we be talking about that at all?
Yeah, okay, and I want to get to the religious cleansing, I guess you might call it, happening against Christians. But first, I want to bring this up. How deadly the conflict in Syria and Iraq is right now, and the fighting happening there compared to what's happening in Israel and Hamas. The number of deaths are just staggering. If we can bring up the quote board now. It reads, so this is from the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. More than 700 people were killed in clashes over 2 days between pro-government forces and Islamic State of Iraq in the Levant, or ISIS militants in Syria. Activists from the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said that the deaths represented the bloodiest fighting since the civil war began in 2011. By Thursday, 270 have been killed in clashes, while the death toll for the day's combined unrest was 396. Friday's death toll reached 314, while 90 more people were still unaccounted for. Precise numbers of ISIS and pro-government casualties in the overall death toll remain unknown. That's before we even get to the religious cleansing aspect of that, which has sent hundreds of thousands of people leaving.
It's an unbelievable tragedy. And if you want another example, I mean, look at the Yarmouk refugee camp in Syria. Prior to the fighting, there were 180,000 Palestinians in that camp. There's 20,000 left. They've been starved. They've been murdered. These are Palestinians. It's a tragedy, and you won't hear that at all.
We did hear yesterday from Yank Barry. He's the Canadian philanthropist who has been spending a lot of his money and time dealing with the flood of refugees coming out of there, specifically Christian refugees. He's helping all kinds, but he thought the Christians are being persecuted there. He's taking them to Sofia, Bulgaria, housing them in 2 hotels. But he said the rest of the world seems to remain silent on this. Why do you think that is?
You know, I wish I had a really good answer for that. I mean, Barack Obama hasn't mentioned this once. I mean, this is another, what a shame. I mean, my God, it's a horrible war being waged against Christians. The ethnic cleansing is just awful. And you have to go to page 72 of the New York Times to find a 3-line piece about it. This is outrageous.
Oftentimes when I'm talking to people about Christians in the Middle East, they will react as if Christians in that part of the world are interlopers, that they're new. Why are they in Muslim lands? And I just find that dumbfounding because you look at the Christians in a city like Mosul, they've been there nearly 2,000 years, predating the Muslim population, at least in terms of people becoming Muslim, by hundreds of years, because Islam came about just before 700 AD.
The Muslims came there after the Christians were there. I mean, people don't know their history. And that's another part of what's going on, is people have no idea what's going on and what's happened. People's knowledge of history is just completely deficient.
So if the mainstream media won't do it, I know you've been involved in blogging and social media for a long time. Most of the media won't focus on this. They'd rather tut Israel. What can people do to spread the word? I know that there are activists on all sides in these things, and we're going to talk about that more a bit later on, but what can people do to spread the word so that the population does know just how bad it is?
Well, there are people out there. I mean, just go, do your part on Facebook and reach out to people who do have an understanding of what's happening. There's no shortage of good articles being written in Front Page Magazine and Pajamas Media and a whole variety of other places that you can go to. Read a little history before you rush to judgment with some horrible comments. Read the Hamas Charter. It's out there on the internet. See what Hamas thinks about Jews and Christians in the Middle East.
And look at what ISIS wants to do with the caliphate. When I started talking about the caliphate a couple of years ago, it was laughed at, was mocked, but ISIS states that that is their goal throughout Syria, Iraq, and the greater Middle East, is they want to return to the caliphate.
They're not shy about their goals. They say it openly. They're proud of their goals. And so people need to understand that. And what we're dealing with are not little nice people around the corner who share our Western values of democracy, liberalism, and free speech. These are people who want Christian and Jews dead.
All right. Fred, great talking to you as always. Thanks so much. And
thank you very much, Brian.
We'll continue to follow this aspect of the story. Thank you.
Thanks.
Stick around. We are not done yet. More on the Mideast coverage, the media bias exposed.
I don't expect you to now change your mind and be pro-Israeli or whatever. I just want you to take a second and try to think outside of the box, try to think outside of what the media is feeding you, because the media always picks a side, and think about the normal people living here and people in Paris or California or I don't know where. Just imagine that in your backyard is a tunnel in which 10 Hamas terrorists are coming out of, and they want to kill you and they want to kill your family.
The ongoing Israel-Gaza war is playing out in a social media war of words. Gina Phillips joins me now to discuss this raging battle that's happening online. Gina, that woman's video reminds me of the Ukrainian woman that went to YouTube, spread her message around the world of what was happening in Euromaidan.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the thing is now you can speak to the entire world by yourself. You're not sending in a tape to a media outlet who then needs to air it and it goes through all these filters. You can speak in a very raw, unedited way, and people are craving this kind of content. We want, I think we're heading this direction more and more as a society, the unfiltered video, the raw footage that allows us to feel what they're going through instead of have the news tell us what they're going through.
Well, and this is being used by both sides in this war, and I know that we'll get to the Israeli Defense Force and their Facebook page and their use of social media, but also Hamas using social media. The technology on the battlefield, they're running around with GoPro cameras and then uploading this video online and saying, look at what we did. We've just killed a bunch of Israeli soldiers using their tunnels. Of course, Israel has been talking about the tunnels. They've been saying that this is a real problem. And check out this video from Hamas themselves showing what they're doing. So here they are, they're coming out of the tunnel, running towards, and this is the soldiers engaged in a firefight with the Israeli Defense Force. Faces are blacked out. That was done by Hamas to protect their own fighters, not by us, but we're not going to show the gory pictures within that.
Yeah, so this is the first time that Hamas has posted a video of one of their raids, so it certainly got a ton of attention. Israel has been doing it for quite some time now. They always videotape their military strategies and their raids as a way to sort of tell people and keep them in the loop with what they're doing. So you don't just see the headline, Israel attacks, anymore. You've already read 10 tweets on why they attacked, their reasonings for it, and how they went about it, and here's the video. So,
and as we've been discussing all show, there is, in my view, and plenty of others, a media bias against Israel within the mainstream media. And so they feel they need to be doing this to get their side out. So that when there is that headline, Israel attacks, they can point to the YouTube video and say,
exactly.
Here's what happened.
Totally. They're also doing a rocket counter, big graphics showing the amount of casualties, number one, but also the rockets fired on Israel, and just showing those numbers and putting it out there in the world. I mean, you risk people misunderstanding it. People come across it that don't normally follow conflicts like this, but there's a benefit to that too, in that you're reaching people that aren't necessarily
I would not have known. Without that tweet going out from the IDF, I would not have known.
Exactly.
2,800, 25 rockets fired by Hamas and its allies since the beginning of this battle.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they're the ones keeping track. So, they're not sending that information to the media outlets first. They're not holding press conferences. They're just putting it out in a really raw way.
Their Facebook page is filled with infographics like this as well.
It certainly is, and pictures and videos. It really is a fight over who can get the most sympathy. It really is a fight over a struggle for the emotion, to capture people's, and the way that they feel about it. It's a war for the hearts and the minds of the people.
Here's a little bit of what you can find if you follow them on either Facebook or Twitter. And if you're not yet, I recommend doing it just so that you can get a different angle on it. But you said there's a war for sympathy.
Yes.
It's not always sympathetic messages, though.
No.
Sometimes vitriol being spewed in, let's admit it, on all sides. But there's a Hitler was right campaign. On Twitter.
Pro-Palestinian activists started tweeting out messages with the hashtag Hitler was right, with things like, we need another Hitler to erase the Israel, it must be wiped out right off the map. So Hitler was right started actually trending, but people were also tweeting about it, which is why it started trending as well, because they were saying, how could you possibly be putting out these hateful messages? Let's not go back in time here. We need to be going forward. So it was very disturbing to see that on the Twitter trending list. And for those who don't know, when something is trending, it just means it got so many mentions that it actually registered and overrode the messages coming out on Twitter.
Okay, so hopefully, maybe people can use social media to try and educate their friends and family about it. I know at the dinner table, we educate my kids about this because these sorts of messages, Hitler was right, is just unbelievable.
I know.
Gina, thanks so much.
Okay,
well,
thank you.
I hope that you've enjoyed our special look at the media coverage over Israel and Gaza Exposed. I hope that we've brought to you enough examples that you can share this with your friends and family. Let them know what's really happening. Let them know that there are alternative viewpoints out there, that this is a battle between a Western liberal democracy and a terrorist group with a stated goal of ridding the world of Israel and Jews, of killing them. They're upfront about it. They will tell you what their goals are if you only listen to them. And we need to listen to people. When they tell you who they are, listen to them. Believe them. Because Hamas isn't shy unfortunately, most of the media is shy in following up and making that part of the story. Thanks for watching. My name is Brian Lilly. We'll see you again soon.